The laws accompanying. 36 chapters were arranged for the political structure and philosophy in the first part from chapter 1 to 14. The second part from chapter 15 to 36 stated the consolidating of the governing system of the Israelites in order to conquer the promised land. The first part ended with the background to why the people required this consolidated governing authority during the 39 years in the desert. When I say numbers, what comes to mind? One of the representative claims on numbers is that it is to discipline the Israelites in the desert for 40 years. Is it correct? Of course, if it is, I may not ask. This is a major misunderstanding on numbers because it is not about the stories during those 40 years. Of course, it was true that the Lord disciplined the Israelites in the desert during the 40 years, but Numbers was not the record of it, like how Genesis was not the biographies of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. Numbers was the stories about the two trials to enter the promised land. The first tribe failed in consequence of their disobedience to the Lord, and they were banished to the desert for their discipline. Then Numbers ended the preparation in the desert for the second trial. It was followed by Deuteronomy, stating the final spiritual discipline of the Israelites and their successive leader Joshua for the second trial. In conclusion, Numbers was not about discipline stories during the 40 years, but only about the two trials to conquer the promised land in the process of fulfilling the covenant given to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob by the Lord. This was for about 1.5 years, or maximum 2 to 3 years, not 40 years. Let's go on to prove this. Number 1. Census, camp layout, and marching. Chapter 1 to 4. The preparation to leave was to set up the political structure for the governing system in Israel. The preparation began with the first census in chapter 1, which was for counting and structuring soldiers of the Israelites to attack the promised land as stated in chapter 1 verse 3. You and Aaron are to number by their divisions all the men in Israel 20 years old or more who are able to serve in the army. Notice the numbers of divisions was only for 20 years old or more, except the Levites. It didn't include women and men that were 19 years old or less. It was followed by chapter 2, describing the camp layout for staying at a place around the tabernacle and the marching order. Let's talk about it on the slides of camp layout and marching. Chapter 3 began with appointing the sons of Aaron as priests and was followed by the Levites' role to support the priests and numbers of the Levites. Open chapter 3 verse 10. Only Aaron and his sons could serve as priests among the Levites. As stated in chapter 3 verse 22, a significant point of the numbers was that all males a month old or more were counted, whereas 20 years old or more were counted for other tribes in chapter 1. The chapter ended with the redemption of the firstborn a month old or more of the Israelites and their livestock by Levites and their livestock. As stated in chapter 3, verse 46, Moses collected the redemption money for 273 firstborn Israelites, which exceeded the number of the Levites, and gave it to Aaron and his sons. Chapter 4 described the roles of Aaron's sons, Kohathites and Gershonites, and Merarites. As stated in chapter 4, verse 3, a significance in numbering them was to count all men from 30 to 50 years of age for the work in the tent of meeting. We will talk about this in detail in the slide on the camp layout next class. Number 2, purification. Chapter 5 began with the purification of the camp by banishing the defiled. The restitution rule of sins followed, and the test for the unfaithful wife by a priest was described in chapter 5, verse 11 to 31. Chapter 6 talked about a special vow, a vow of separation to the Lord as a Nazarite. The chapter ended to show us how to bless the Israelites, as stated in chapter 6, verse 24 to 26. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face toward you and give you peace. Chapter 7 described the dedication offerings. What were the dedication offerings? For what? What did they dedicate? The tabernacle and the altar. As stated in chapter 7 verse 1, when Moses finished the setting of the tabernacle, the leaders of Israel made offerings of 12 oxen and 6 covered carts, evenly collected from the 12 tribes. As stated in chapter 7 verse 5, Moses distributed the offerings to the Levites according to their duties, which will be stated on the slide on camp layout, the next class. As stated in chapter 7, verse 10 to 88, each day one leader brought his offering for the dedication of the altar during the 12 days for the 12 tribes. They offered 12 silver plates, 12 silver sprinkling bowls, and 12 gold dishes filled with incense and utensils. 12 young bulls, 12 rams, 12 male lambs, a year old, were for burnt offerings with a grain offering. 12 male goats were for sin offering. 24 oxen, 60 rams, 60 male goats, 60 male lambs, a year old, were for fellowship offerings. A significance of this dedication offering was the order of the 12 leaders, which was the order of tribes from east, south, west, north. Let's see it on the slide of the camp layout. Chapter 8 began with the method of lighting the lamp in the tent of meeting and purified the Levites who were from 25 to 49 years of age before starting their work in the tent of meeting, as stated in chapter 8 verse 24. Number 3, marching and guidance. Chapter 9 was chronically prior to chapter 1 because chapter 9 verse 1 stated, the date of the Passover as the first month of the second year after they came out of Egypt. As stated in chapter 9 verse 10, a significance was that the Lord's device for those who were unclean or away on a journey on the Passover. They celebrated the Passover on the 14th of the second month instead of the first month. The rule of marching was described in chapter 9, verse 15 to 23. It was very simple, as stated in chapter 9, verse 17. Whenever the cloud lifted from above the tent, the Israelites set out. Whenever the cloud settled, the Israelites encamped. Chapter 10 began with a trumpet signal. As stated in chapter 10, verse 2, 2 trumpets of hammered silver were made, and as stated in chapter 10, verse 8, only the priests blew the trumpets in calling the community and having the camps set out, as stated in chapter 10, verse 2. How many cases were described? 7 cases were written in chapter 10, verse 1 to 10. Assembling the whole community in verse 3, assembling the heads of the clans in verse 4, gathering the assembly in verse 7, setting up the tribes camping on the east in verse 5 and the south in verse 6, going into battle against enemies in verse 9, and at appointed feasts and new moon festivals in verse 10. How many times did they blow for marching? Only twice for the east and the south. Why didn't they blow for the west and the north? Because they only blew when first the ark and coverings and structures of the tabernacle set out, and second, when the tribes with the utensils of the tabernacle set out. As stated in chapter 10, verse 11, at last they set out on the 20th day of the second month of the second year from the desert of Sinai, and traveled to the desert of Paran, as stated in chapter 10, verse 12. The process of marching was described in chapter 10, verse 14 to 28. Let's see it in detail on the slide of marching. An important tip to discover the location of Mount Sinai was stated in chapter 10, verse 31. But Moses said, "Please do not leave us. You know where we should camp in the desert, and you can be our eyes." This means Hobab or Ithro, Moses' father-in-law, knew the desert very well, where the Israelites were going to pass through to the promised land. Since his father-in-law was from Midian, not from the Sinai Peninsula, these deserts were probably in Media. Till this, it was still the second month. The first 10 chapters from chapter 1 to 10 stated the stories during the 2 months of the second year for sure. Number 4, disobedience. Chapter 11 began with the Lord's fire punishment against the Israelites' complaint as seen in chapter 11 verse 1 to 3. Starting from chapter 11, verse 4 to 35, the next story was about the quail given to the people as meat by the Lord for a month and setting up 70 elders to support Moses after the Lord heard Moses' cry, saying in chapter 11, verse 15, "If this is how you are going to treat me, put me to death right now if I have found favor in your eyes, and do not let me face my own ruin." Because of this incident, as said in chapter 11, verse 10, Moses burst with anger due to the people's complaint. Chapter 12 described the incident of Aaron and Miriam blaming Moses because of his Cushite wife. As stated in chapter 12, verse 8, the Lord distinguished Moses from the other prophets. The Lord spoke with him face to face, whereas he spoke with prophets in visions or dreams, as stated in chapter 12, verse 6. From a spiritual point of view, this gives us an instructions on how we treat our spiritual leaders. Chapter 13 and 14 described the exploration of the promised land. As said in chapter 13 verse 3, Moses sent them out from the desert of Paran by the Lord's command. This was contradictory to Deuteronomy chapter 1 verse 21 to 22. "See, the Lord your God has given you the land. Go up and take possession of it, as the Lord, the God of your fathers, told you. Do not be afraid, do not be discouraged." Then all of you came to me and said, "Let us send men ahead to spy out the land for us and bring back a report about the route we are to take and the towns we will come to." How can we interpret this? In Deuteronomy, Moses said that people came to him and suggested sending men to spy on the land, even though the Lord had commanded to go up and take possession of it. But in Numbers, it was not through the people's suggestion, but by the Lord's command, which was correct, considering the Lord's providence as a user and their report of the exploration. It would not have been the Lord's command. Therefore, we can imagine the incident's whole scenario. Moses prayed to the Lord about the people's suggestion. Then the Lord commanded Moses to send them, as stated in Numbers chapter 1 verse 2, for a test. As seen in chapter 13 verse 25, the 12 leaders explored the land for 40 days and reported in 2 ways. 10 leaders claimed they could not conquer it, but Joshua and Caleb insisted they could do, as stated in chapter 14 verse 8, "If the Lord is pleased with us, he will lead us into that land, a land flowing with milk and honey, and will give it to us." The Lord planned to strike them down and rebuild a greater nation because of their embarrassing report. But he forgave them in response to Moses' petition. But he punished them, as seen in chapter 14, verse 23. "Not one of them will ever see the land I promised on oath to their forefathers. No one who has treated me with contempt will ever see it." As stated in chapter 14, verse 28, "As surely as I live, declares the Lord, I will do to you the very things I heard you say." What was he going to do? He was going to make all of them who were 20 years old or more and grumbled against him die in the desert, as stated in chapter 14, verse 29. Hence it declared in chapter 14 verse 13, "Not one of you will enter the land I swore with uplifted hand to make your home, except Caleb son of Jephunneh and Joshua son of Nun." This passage is an important key to figuring out the chronicle of chapter 20. And as seen in chapter 14 verse 37, these men responsible for spreading the bad report about the land were struck down and died of a plague before the Lord. They were killed. Even though the Lord's command, as stated in chapter 14 verse 33, "Your children will be shepherds here for 40 years, suffering for your unfaithfulness until the last of your bodies lies in the desert," and Moses restraining them from attacking their enemy. The Israelites attacked the land. They were defeated by the enemies as seen in chapter 14, verse 45. As stated in Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 1, it took 11 days to go from Horeb to Kadesh. It was probably the middle or the end of the 4th month when they returned from the exploration. Therefore, 14 chapters from 1 to 14 stated the stories during the 4 months of the 2nd year. Number 5, priest leadership. Chapter 15 certainly began with the offerings to sacrifice after entering the land, which was not connected to chapter 14. It was followed by an incident breaking the Sabbath. A scholar insisted that the wood was a Zelophehad, which was an important source of food and fire during the rainy season. In context, this incident might be related to the episode of the inheritance for Zelophehad's daughters, as stated in chapter 27, verse 3. Chapter 16 stated that Korah rebelled because they wanted to be priests, but only Aaron and his sons were allowed. Why did they disobey like this? Did they really want to priest role? As said in chapter 16 verse 14, "Moreover, you haven't brought us into a land flowing with milk and honey, or given us an inheritance of fields and vineyards." These were probably the real reasons behind the rebellion. As written in chapter 16 verse 49, because of this, the 14,700 Israelites died from a plague. In consequence to this, the Lord confirmed Aaron's priesthood in chapter 17 through the test of 12 steps. Only Aaron's staff had budded, blossomed, and produced the almonds. The almond was shakad in Hebrew, which means the one who keeps it. Chapter 18 described the Levites and priests' duties and their portions and tithe. Chapter 19 introduced a tool for the water of cleansing, as stated in chapter 19, verse 9. It was the ashes made by burning a heifer. Why did the Lord give this instruction? For purification of the defiled people. 5 chapters from 15 to 19 were probably the preparation to enter the land by consolidating and emphasizing offerings, the Sabbath duties, and purification. Therefore, this would happen in the 40th year or much closed years. Number 6, the faithful Lord. Chapter 20 began with the death of Miriam at Kadesh in the 1st month. It was followed by the Meribah water incident. Since Moses hit a rock twice against the Lord's command, he could not enter the land. From a spiritual point of view, this was planned to fulfill the prophecy as stated in chapter 14, verse 30. No one would enter the land except Joshua and Caleb. Aaron died at Mount Hor. It was on the 1st day of the 5th month, as written in chapter 33, verse 38. It took around 4 months to move from Kadesh to Mount Hor. Chapter 21 described the 2 stories, the victories of Hormah, Amory, and Bashan, and the incident of the bronze snake. From a spiritual point of view, many people insist that the bronze snake was an antitype of Jesus, because those who saw it were saved. But we can also interpret it as an obedience to the Lord's command, or trust in His promise, or to present His device even in His punishment. This was a demonstration to convince the Israelites to follow the Lord's command and trust His promise of the promised land. There is an interesting story about the Midian priest Balaam. Why did the Lord assign 3 chapters to this story? He was a very covetous person and tried to earn more money from the Moabite king to curse the Israelites. But he failed to curse them and instead blessed them, as stated in chapter 23 verse 10. Who can count the dust of Jacob or number the first part of Israel? Through this story, the Lord might have wanted to show his providence and might to the Israelites and Canaanites. Chapter 25 was the last demonstration of the Lord for the Israelites before entering the land. As seen in chapter 25 verse 2, the subject was idolatry to Baal of Peor. It was brought from their sexual immorality with the Moabite woman, as written in chapter 25 verse 1. Both spiritual and physical sins to defy their purification, which the Lord hated the most, were emphasized by the result of following another incident, as stated in chapter 25 verse 6 to 9. It was that Phinehas killed both an Israelite and a Midianite woman at the same time when they laid together. Through these incidents, 24,000 Israelites were murdered by a plague as seen in chapter 25 verse 9. Please open the book of 1 Corinthians chapter 10 verse 8. We should not commit sexual immorality as some of them did, and in one day 23,000 of them died. Which was correct? In Numbers 24,000 and in Colossians 23,000. 24,000 was the total number of the dead by the plague, and 23,000 was for one day. Chapter 26 was the second census. What was the purpose of the census? Did anyone figure out as you were reading? As stated in chapter 26 verse 2, the first purpose was to take a census of those 20 years old or more who were able to serve in the army. The second purpose was to check if the prophecy of chapter 14 verse 30 had been fulfilled or not. What was it? All people 20 years old or more at the first census would be killed in the desert. Do you agree? I presumed this. Once you presume something, you need to confirm it with the Logos. Open chapter 26 verse 64. Not one of them was among those counted by Moses and Aaron, the priest, when they counted the Israelites in the desert of Sinai. They checked and no one was included in the second census. In connection to this, we could consider that the incident of Phinehas in chapter 25 happened as a fulfillment of it. The third purpose was to distribute their inheritance according to their numbers, as stated in chapter 33, verse 54. Distribute the land by lot according to your clans. To a larger group, give a larger inheritance. There were some differences between the first and second census in numbers. Let's see them later on the slide of the frame of census. These happened in the 40th year after they had come out of Egypt. Number 7, inheritance and a feast. Chapter 27 began with a story about Zelophehad's daughters for their inheritance. Usually, daughters were not eligible to receive the inheritance of their family, but they requested Moses and he allowed them to receive the inheritance. Chapter 27 verse 3 stated that their father died for his own sin. Why was this information given here? I guess this might refer to the Sabbath incident in chapter 15. Chapter 28 began with the daily offering, which was to sacrifice burnt offerings every morning and evening. It was followed by the Sabbath offerings, monthly offerings, and 5 feasts: the Passover, the Feast of Weeks, the Feast of Trumpets, Day of Atonement, and the Feast of Tabernacle. An interesting thing was the number of offerings of Feast of Tabernacle. The number of young bulls began with 13 from the first day and decreased by 1 every day to 7 on the 7th day. Then on the 8th day, they sacrificed only 1 young bull. Chapter 30 began with a vow to the Lord, specially described for woman's vow in different cases. In chapter 31 began with the vengeance on the Midianites, and they killed all Midianite men, as stated in chapter 31, verse 7. This was the vengeance for the idolatry in chapter 25. Chapter 32 talked about the east land assignment to Reubenites, Gadites, and half-tribe of Manasseh. Chapter 33 described the stage of journey from Egypt to Moab in more detail than in Exodus and Deuteronomy. Let's see the journey in detail in slide on stages of journey in next class. Chapter 34 began with the boundaries of the promised land. It started from the south as stated in verse 3 to 5, for the west in verse 6, for the north in verse 7 to 9, and for the east in verse 10 to 12. As written in chapter 34, verse 16, the Lord appointed Eleazar, the priest, and Joshua to allocate the land to the tribes. It was followed by the appointment of leaders from each tribe who helped allocate the land as their inheritance, as seen in verses 16 to 29. Chapter 35 described the towns for the Levites and the cities of refuge in each tribe. As stated in verse 6, 6 towns for refuge and 42 towns for their portions were allotted to the Levites. Those who were eligible to escape to the cities of refuge were stated in verses 22 to 28. Those who were not eligible and must have been killed were described in verses 16 to 21 and 29 to 34. Chapter 36 was for the inheritance of Zelophehad's daughters. They married within the clans of the descendants of Manasseh for the inheritance. All these stories from chapter 16 to 36 were in the 40th year, and chapter 15 was also in the 40th year or close to the year. How many years of stories were described in Numbers? The first part of Numbers was only for around 4 months, and the second part was for 1 year or a maximum of 2 to 3 years. Numbers was not about 40 years in the desert. As you saw, it only described their first attempt to attack the promised land at Kadesh after coming out of Egypt, and the journey to Moab from Kadesh for the second attack on the land. For those attacks, they counted the people serving in their army twice. This is Numbers. During those journeys, the Lord demonstrated as management on various incidents incurred by the Israelites to discipline them. Thank you for watching.